Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. A very warm welcome again to today's panel discussion on teaching in academic recruitment. It's great to see so many of you join us, and I can see that people are still filtering through, so I'm going to make a slow start. But we're delighted to be joined today by five lecturers, five speakers who are going to help us discuss teaching in academic recruitment. So just to give this session a little bit of context before we get going, it is part of a series of events and resources called Navigating the Academic Job Market, which is an annual series, essentially, which we've been delivering, I think, for the last 2 or 3 years now. And we create it for Cambridge postdocs and PhDs who are interested in pursuing, or indeed pursuing, an academic career. So as part of Navigating the Academic Job Market this year, we're launching a series of blogs and a number of short videos on YouTube, which intend to support you in finding your way around the academic job market, particularly in the UK. And those videos and blogs cover a range of topics such as getting to know the academic sector, how it's structured, how it's funded, how it's measured, in fact, how there are different frameworks that measure it, and how you might read an academic job description to make a good application. So we'll point you to those resources at the end of the session. And this panel discussion is the first of our 2 live sessions as part of Navigating the Academic Job Market. And we really wanted to use this time through these live events to think particularly about teaching and its role in an academic career and in being recruited to that career. So it's really an opportunity for us to focus together on teaching in your academic career. So our 5 panelists who've happily agreed to be with us today are going to help us to focus on these issues today about how teaching is assessed in the recruitment process and what it's like to be teaching in the lectureship role. So before we go ahead and ask people to introduce themselves more specifically, I'll just give you a little sense of how the session is going to work today. So people have started very kindly to say hello to us in the chat, which is great, but please carry on doing that if you've just joined us. It's always great for speakers and people running the session to get a sense of who's in the audience. So people have been very careful to tell us which department they're in, what they're researching, whether they're doing a PhD or a postdoc. So welcome to all of those of you who've shared that information in the chat. That's fantastic. And we will come back to you in the latter part of the session where we'll invite you to put some questions to our speakers. But initially, for about the first half an hour of today, we're going to hear specifically from our speakers who are going to tell us a bit about their career pathway, how they came from their PhD to the role that they're currently in. We're also going to ask them about how they've experienced showcasing or evidencing teaching skills in the recruitment process, whether that's from their own recruitment and the process that they went through, or whether they've been involved in recruitment themselves and how they've seen it be assessed in recruitment. And we're also going to ask them to share what their current teaching commitments and responsibilities are like, so we can get a sense of how they're teaching. And then finally, we're going to ask our speakers in their introductions to share one thing they wish they'd known about teaching earlier on in their career. So those are the things that you can expect to hear from our speakers initially, and then we'll give you an opportunity to ask some questions. And we're really conscious that everybody has got very individual circumstances when it comes to their academic career, and we might not be able to use this forum to answer everyone's very, very individual circumstances and questions. We do have one-to-one appointments available for you to ask about your own specific circumstances. So really, it's just an invitation to be mindful about the kind of questions that we can ask that would be helpful for everyone's knowledge and understanding of teaching and how it's assessed in the recruitment process. So that is just kind of my opening, and I'm going to hand over to our speakers now to introduce themselves. So I'm just going to flash back onto this slide so you can see who's talking initially. So we have got Shreyasi, who is currently at the University of Liverpool, and Sue, who's a senior lecturer here at the University of Cambridge in the Department of Neuroscience. And we've got Samantha, who is working at the University of Teesside in engineering, and Carolanne, who is working at the University of Sheffield. And we will be joined as well in a few moments by Maria as well, who's at the University of Westminster, but she's not able to join us until a little bit later. So without further ado, I'm going to start by asking Shreyasi to deliver her introduction. Thank you, Shreyasi, if I could hand over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, and really happy to be a part of this panel with everyone and to hear all your thoughts. My name is Dr. Shreyashi Dasgupta, and I'm a lecturer in human geography at the Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Liverpool, focusing kind of both on teaching and research side of things as a part of my role here. Prior to Liverpool, I did my ESRC postdoctoral fellowship in geography at Cambridge, and I also did my PhD and MPhil, which was in development studies at Cambridge as well. In between all this, I also taught for a year at an Indian university called OP Jindal in India, which was a primarily teaching-focused position. So literally those two kind of 2 years of experience, one in a more kind of teaching focused role, and ESRC one, which was more a research focused position before the Liverpool sort of permanent lectureship position worked out. And so that's where I come from into all of this. It's been about 2 years now that I've been at Liverpool, that I've been teaching. I would say realistically, maybe about a year and a half, as I just recently got back from maternity leave and again getting back into the position as well. So overall, to answer the second question, which was being asked about teaching, I think when I was doing my preparation for these positions and a couple of places where I got shortlisted for the lectureship interview and stuff, I think most universities asked to demonstrate teaching in the recruitment process. For some universities, they gave us a prompt about doing a presentation showcasing our approach to teaching. Just to give you all maybe an example of a question that I got was, to do a presentation on your approach to teaching with a focus on a core geographical teaching, including aspects of like social and political geography. And was specific to, of course, the discipline that I was applying to, and that there were also questions from other universities where the brief said, how do you see your future research and teaching plans contributing to the specific department that I was applying to? So these were the kind of broad prompts that we got during the shortlist process. And I guess the presentation that I delivered then focused on elements of my teaching philosophy, teaching methods, subjects that I had already taught, but also subjects that I would potentially be interested in teaching in the department that I would be joining. And then there was also some kind of expectation that all of this should be tied a little bit specifically to the university I was applying to and to how that fits within their wider framework of teaching and research. For example, in Liverpool, we have something called the Liverpool Curriculum Framework, and within which there are like defined parameters of what kind of expectations and vision the university has around teaching. So to kind of tie into those aspects as well, also dimensions about like future plans in teaching and what I might be interested in doing in the future, expectations around maybe incorporating student feedback if you have anything from past teaching experience to showcase some aspects of evidence of feedback from students. So, yeah, I can talk about more depending on the questions that you might have. But then moving on to the next bit about my current role, I teach on a wide variety of modules on urban, political, and development geographies across all undergraduate and postgraduate year groups. Which means that I lead on specific modules. I focus on lecture writing, delivery, marking, designing modules, running seminars and tutorials, supervision of dissertation students, a little bit on course administration around moderations and so on, but also collaborating with colleagues on like team taught modules, because a lot of modules that we teach in Liverpool are like co-taught by a couple of lecturers. And then the last point about where what I wish I would have known earlier. There are several things I wish I would have known earlier. And the main thing I think is about the pedagogical aspects of teaching, in terms of how much time it takes as a new lecturer to like prepare for all these courses that we teach, but also not just about the lecture material, but the dimensions of class engagement and student participation. So that element of facilitation, which is equally important in the wider scheme of things while planning for a lecture. I think I learned some of those aspects on the way and still kind of learning. So happy to hear from everyone else. I think I'm probably past my time, so we'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shreyasi. There's already lots of questions that I'd really like to ask you, especially around the team teaching and how that sort of continued learning happens around facilitating and engaging students in lectures. But I'm going to move on through everybody and then see what kind of questions we have in the chat. But thank you so much, Shreyasi, for that brilliant introduction. And now, if I could hand on to Sue for your introduction, please, that would be fantastic.
Thank you, Vicky, and a warm welcome to everyone who's joined us today. So as Vicky introduced me, I'm in the development of, Department of Physiology, Development and Neuroscience. So just from that name alone, you can probably imagine we teach quite a broad amount of material. More on that in a moment. So I'm a senior lecturer and an associate professor, so I have a research group as well. The way I got to that point in my career was I did an undergraduate degree at King's College London in pharmacology, during which time I really focused as much as possible on neurobiology. I then did a PhD at University College London, again focusing on neuroscience. I then went off to the USA to do postdoctoral work for 5 years, and I had 1 year on my own fellowship. During that entire time, I did very little teaching, but this was quite a long time ago. So I got my job here in Cambridge in 2001. But I knew I enjoyed teaching when I did do it. And so when I was coming for my job interview here, I actually, in a bit of a mad scramble, volunteered for lots of teaching at Brown University so I could get a taste for it. Probably wouldn't advocate leaving it till that late in the day to do that, but it worked out okay. When I applied for my job, I did write a lot about how I could contribute to the teaching. I spent a lot of time thinking about where I could fit in. So I looked at what was online and so on. And I would definitely advocate doing your homework there. We do have people who apply for jobs and they seem to have no idea what we teach, and that always surprises me. So when I applied for my job, I only had to give a talk on my research. But as part of giving the talk on my research, I suppose I was assessed as to whether I could speak clearly and put together some slides. But that's perhaps not that helpful to you guys today, because as Shreyashi was saying, I think now almost all universities would ask you to give some kind of teaching presentation. In PDN, I've sat on recruitment panels for several new lecture posts now, and every time we've asked people to give the first 10 to 15 minutes of an undergraduate lecture. And we give them the topic. There's no choice here. And we deliberately pick a topic that no one in the shortlist works on, because we want to see how people do when they're a little bit outside of their comfort zone. And that, if someone asks you to do that, that's a message to you that is important. We once had someone turn up and say, why have I got to do this? So yeah, didn't convey a good impression. So when we're shortlisting, we also do score applicants on their, as well as on their research, on their papers and any grant funding. We do score them on undergraduate teaching experience and examples of service like committee work and so on. So do mention them in applications. And then in the interview, we probe further into those questions as well. Very similar, I think, to what Shreyashi was saying. One thing I can maybe mention here, if that's okay, is often people in their application talk about their experience of mentoring people in their research projects, and that's great. But what really stands out to us is if somebody's taken the initiative to deliver a lecture to students, whether it's postgrads or undergrads, or to demonstrate in some practical classes if that's possible to do. So something that isn't centered around the research that you do anyway, where you take yourself out of your comfort zone a little bit. So I've been teaching in Cambridge for more than 20 years now, and I teach a wide range of subjects from human anatomy dissection up to final year students in their highly specialized dissertation projects. I give some of my lectures to lecture rooms with 400 medics and vets, and others are a room of 10 students doing their final year with us. I contribute to course organization, course development, redevelopment. I sit on teaching strategy committee in the department. I examine every year, and sometimes I'm a senior examiner. And I also sit on quite a lot of committees. Particularly, I like those that are concerned with making my department a more positive and inclusive place and considering the diverse needs of students as we evolve. And so, for example, one of my projects in the last few years was to redevelop the library from a place full of books to a place full of people studying. So I also have a lab, and I love working with the students in my lab as well. I consider that important teaching as well. I would say about in a typical year, I probably have 40 contact hours with undergraduate students, but that in no way reflects the amount of time I spend preparing it all and administering it all. Okay, one thing I wish I'd known, as Shreyashi said, there's so many things, but maybe one thing is I wish I'm more relaxed about it when I was younger, as I am now, because I used to worry a lot about whether it would all go perfectly. And in worrying about it, I made myself stressed, and that came across as not the most positive environment. I sometimes made everyone around me stressed. And I found that when I stopped worrying so much and was a bit more relaxed, everyone around me was more relaxed, and then people learn better. So I think that would be try to relax and enjoy teaching, because it's really fun, isn't it? Well, hopefully you think that's why you're here. I think that's it.
Thank you so much, Sue. And I'm echoing the person who just sent a heart in the chat, and another person who sent a heart in the chat, because especially that last thing you wish you'd known earlier on in your teaching. So thank you very much for sharing that experience of sort of feeling stress and thinking that it might be coming out in your teaching. I think that's so true in so many situations, actually, but I can see in teaching it's such a visible thing that you're doing, isn't it? You're in front of people and it's almost like you're kind of performing. So thank you very much for sharing that with all of us. And again, I think there's something in common with what Shreyasi was saying about the number of hours that you're teaching versus the number of hours that you're preparing for it. So I wonder if that might come out a little bit in the Q&A as well. So again, thank you so much, Sue. That was fantastic. And I'm now going to come to Samantha for her introduction. Thanks, Samantha.
Thanks, Vicky. And hi, everybody. and I'm going to try not to repeat what Sue has just said, but I found that a lot of my notes she seems to have stolen because there is quite a lot of some kind of commonality in our views on the recruitment side of things. So I'll try and kind of elaborate on a few things where I think are unique to my experience. But just to start off with kind of where I've kind of how I've got to what I'm doing now. So I am very much a product of the Cambridge system. I moved to the UK from Sri Lanka for my undergraduate in chemical engineering at Churchill College, and I stayed there for my PhD. So same department, same college for, I think it was 9 years in the end, by the time I left Cambridge. So during my PhD, I mean, I started doing a PhD because I wanted to be my lecturers. So I remember sitting in a third year class going, right, I want that job. I want to be doing that. And so whilst the research, I think enjoyable, depending on how the experiments are going, is quite a testing topic. But for me, it was a means to an end in terms of getting that qualification, because all the lecturers I saw had PhDs. So I thought, right, okay, that's what I need to do. And in the end, yes, that was what I needed to do. But I think my motivation for doing it was slightly different. And I really did not want to do a postdoc because I saw the postdocs in kind of everyone I knew, they were doing postdoc after postdoc, hoping that a lectureship became available. And for me, that lack of job security, I found quite unappealing. So, I mean, I've been working at Teesside for 13 years now. So it was 13 years ago that I applied for jobs. And I think I was fortunate that there was a university that had a more teaching focus, that was looking for someone to do teaching at the time that I wanted to do a teaching related job. So I have to stress there is a lot of luck involved. Okay, you cannot just walk into a job, even though on paper it seems like I did. I know I'm extremely lucky that the stars aligned at that time. But in order to kind of, I mean, when I did the interview, and I've spoken to colleagues since to say, how did I end up getting the job? How did that work? Because I was up against applicants who had a much stronger research pedigree. They had done multiple postdocs, they had their own PhD students and everything. And here I was, fresh from a PhD saying, please give me a lectureship. So there are a few things. One is, I think it's not called the Teaching Associate Program now. I've checked. It's now the Accredited Teaching Development Programs run by the Centre for Teaching and Learning at Cambridge. So I did the equivalent that we had then, and I got Associate Fellowship of Advanced HE. Now, most universities now will have a contractual obligation for new teaching staff to get Fellowship of Advanced HE, because it's something that it's a KPI for most universities. If you have associate fellowship, sometimes they say, yeah, that's enough in order to meet the contractual obligation. So that can be quite, it's like, oh, this person has taken the initiative to do this CPD. It shows a commitment to teaching. So I think if you have the opportunity to enroll on that and do that, I think that would help. I've seen some questions in the chat around what do we mean by teaching philosophy. Those kind of CPD programs cover all of that. So that's the best way for you to learn what we mean by teaching philosophy and the pedagogic side of things, how to deal with students, all those things are covered in those kind of programs. So I'd strongly recommend that you do that. And the other thing is, so I did a fair bit of supervision as a PhD student, partly for the money, partly because, well, I liked the teaching side of it. So I did as many different things as I could without having it impact on my PhD progression. That's the only formal teaching I had. So there was another question about whether supervision is enough. If you frame it right, yes, it is. If you do the supervision as a means to get whatever, hourly rate and just say, all right, here, do the example sheet and right, I'm done, I'm going home now, then you don't actually have much to reflect on. But if you actually engage with your tutees and you get that rapport and you try and contribute to their learning, then you will get more out of it than you thought you would. So I think that really helped me. In my interview, I was asked, it's like, right, okay, so you've done this small group teaching. Have you ever given a lecture? And the answer was no, but I had to frame that in a way that didn't sound like a negative. And the thing is, I have been performing on stage since I was a tiny kid, in choirs and orchestras and things like that. So Vicky, when you mentioned that it's performance, yeah, lecturing is performance art. It is not necessary. You're not coming up with the topic yourself. You're reading textbooks and you're producing PowerPoint slides based on information that already exists. What you are bringing to the room, what you are bringing to your students is your way to describe, to explain the topic. So it is that performance art. It is being able to hold the attention of whether it's 5 students or 500 students, being able to get them to put their phones down and listen to you for the hour or 2 hours or whatever you have them for. So I said, no, I haven't given a lecture, but I have performed on stage to hundreds of people throughout my teenage years. So big crowds don't scare me. I am able to kind of present the information. And the person who asked me ended up being my boss, and she had been absolutely fine with that, because it was that recognition that, oh yeah, it's not just about knowing the stuff, it's being able to communicate the stuff to the audience, as it were. So so I think that's something that I wanted to make sure that all of you kind of were aware about. In terms of what I do now, I am in charge of staffing and resources for the engineering department. So I manage staff workloads and timetables for about 70 members of staff. And we have a department of almost 2,000 students. So I have to make sure that everybody can get to the right lesson at the right time. So my brain's a little bit chaotic on most days. I also teach. So I teach at undergraduate level. And I used to run the design project for the undergraduate, so final year capstone project for chemical engineers, which is a big thing. But I've handed that over now, because as the administrative, as the management kind of activities have taken more of a prominent role. But I still do teach, and I still assess, still lead modules, still get involved in all that aspect of it. I think Sue mentioned about MSc supervision. I would go so far as to say, if somebody tells me that their teaching experience is that they've supervised MScs, that's actually a turn off for me, because that, to me, that says they don't fully understand what teaching is. Supervising MSc students is just helping out with more research. That's just doing what you're supposed to do as a PhD student or as a postdoc. That's just part of that job. So go through the curriculum for the courses that you are applying to teach on. Really familiarize yourself with those curricula. You are 9 times out of 10, you're not going to be able to make a module that aligns with your research. You are going to be told to teach. This person retired. We have this module that needs to be delivered next week. Off you go. And sometimes it is that that short notice. Hopefully it won't be. But you need to be prepared to get your hands dirty, get stuck in, earn the right to request modules that you like. That's my kind of thing. As a manager, I like people who say, okay, I'm not really familiar with that. Give me a bit of time to read up on it and I'll come up with something, rather than that's not my area. Right? Because if you're being asked, your manager already knows that it's not your area, but they're desperate. They don't have anybody else. So, and as a new lecturer, you will be bottom of the ladder, I'm afraid. So you have to work your way up. And I think that is the bit that I think a lot of new lecturers wish they would have known, that it wasn't going to be, you get to do, oh, I get to do my bit and then I do a bit of teaching. No, it is chaos for the first few years. And then you start to carve your little niche area. I think the other thing that I would say that I wish I had known about was about the concept of a staff workload. So different universities have this in different ways. Some have it more established than others. But there will be someone in the department that you apply to whose job it is to make sure it's like, right, okay, how many hours does this person get for research? How many hours does this person get for teaching? How many hours do they get for outreach activities? How many hours do they get for personal tutoring, and so on? And they are the ones going to carve up your time. So your time is not your own until you get to, I would say, associate professor role, where your research hours are such that you can say, well, I'm doing research, get somebody else to do it. And then the new lecturer will have to take on that bit. So there's a bit of a hierarchy going on. But depending on where you apply to, see if that institution has a workload framework. That will help you understand the culture of that university. And then that will help you understand how much autonomy you will have over your time. Probably not a lot, but at least you then know what you're getting yourself into. And I think that probably covers what I wanted to share.
Thank you so much, Samantha, and thank you for adjusting it so you could add to what had already been said. I'm very grateful for that. And it sounds like, I mean, it's interesting to see the potential track for teaching and how you, when you take on more senior positions that have more oversight potentially over how the teaching happens and the logistics for everything. And how that might take you away from the teaching a little bit as well. So it's interesting to see that trajectory. And thank you as well for sort of giving that understanding of what teaching might look like in those first few years. And I get the impression from you that actually having that flexibility when you go into teaching as a new lecturer is something that could be quite important. And I think getting a sense of the workload, if you can, as well, like what's the balance, what's the teaching likely to look like? I think that's really great advice. So thank you so much for that. I can see some questions in the chat and I will come to those in a moment. But now I'm going to come, if it's okay, to Carolanne for her introduction.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Good to see loads of people here today. So I'm Carolanne Bourriot. I'm a lecturer in the University of Sheffield. So it's a teaching and research role. So I'm a lecturer in building physics in what is now the School of Mechanical, Aerospace and Civil Engineering. So originally I did MEng in aeronautical engineering at Imperial College London. And then I decided to stay on to do a PhD. So I joined at the time there was a CDT in fluid dynamics, so I did an MRes and then followed on by a PhD in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. So that was kind of looking at modeling indoor air quality and ventilation, those types of things. I stayed on for a bit as a postdoc afterwards, and then I came to Cambridge for a year as a postdoc and I was based then in the Department of Applied Maths and Theoretical Physics, so a bit different from my engineering background. And basically when I was in Cambridge, I saw an advert come out for this role in Sheffield, which was kind of focusing on indoor air quality, ventilation, so very similar to my research, and Sheffield is where I wanted to live. So it was pretty perfect. And I think there was a bit of chance, as it's been mentioned before. It was the right time for me, the right topic. So yeah. And then I got in and I officially started as a lecturer last year. So in September 2023. So it still feels quite new. I guess I wanted to bring up a bit of, and I saw there's been questions about this, in terms of teaching experience during my PhD and my postdoc. So when I was at Imperial, I from the start, I think I was kind of encouraged, let's say, to help out on the fluid mechanics courses. So as a graduate teaching assistant, and I was kind of helping out in big tutorials, so maybe 100 students, but then you have a couple of teaching assistants and the lecturer as well, helping out on problem classes, those types of things. I was also demonstrating labs, so helping students set up the kind of experiment and intake measurements, those types of things. And then when I was in Cambridge, I did some supervision in Lucy Cavendish for engineering students. So it was quite good to go from the more GTA one, where it was very structured, I was just kind of following on what was happening, to having to try a totally different way of doing things, something that I hadn't experienced as a student. So it was really scary, but I think it was quite good to have to just come up with how to do stuff, and then that was a good way to get some confidence as well. So I would recommend this experience, even if you might end up teaching much larger groups. In terms of what I had to do as part of the recruitment process, so there was 2 kind of rounds. The first one was what was a selection day, and as part of that, I had to do a presentation on the research vision, and then there was also a 10-minute teaching presentation. So I was given a list of subjects, topics that I could choose from, but I mean, they were quite very focused on building ventilation, let's say, but I could pick which one I wanted to do, and then I just had to I was told, oh, this is a 3rd-year module for undergraduate students, teach for 10 minutes. And then there was a few questions afterwards about how I would have added some more practical examples if it was a longer lecture, and how I would have examined it, for example. So I think as part of this, I was told not to talk about my teaching philosophy, which is something that that was brought up in the chat, but more kind of display and demonstrate how I teach instead of just talking about it. So that was kind of the first round. And then the second one was more of a traditional interview. And I would say teaching came up quite a lot. It was maybe a third of the questions. And then a third was more research. And then the rest is more like, have you ever worked as a team, and more of an HR type questions. And then, so the ones that kind of stood out as part of that was, I think Samantha's touched on it. It was also asking me what I would be happy to teach, and then kind of showing that I would be willing to do something that maybe I hadn't taught previously. So I think I probably said that I could teach thermofluids, which is something I'd supervised on in Cambridge, but then I could try and do something else as well. A few times, and that was in the 2 rounds as well, there was some questions about what to do if a student came up to you with a specific, maybe more personal problem, and that was more of how you would approach pastoral care. And I think this was more the way I saw it, and I've talked to other people about it. It's not really, it's about acknowledging that you're not a therapist in a way, and then also knowing that there's support systems at the university. So it's definitely worth looking into if you have an interview with a specific university to kind of know what they have in place. And generally it's similar things, but it's quite good to know. So in terms of what I do now, I think, yeah, it's quite similar to what's been described. The expectation was that the teaching load was going to ramp up in my 3 years. I think I was thrown a bit in the deep end as well. So it's quite a light teaching load initially. So I do maybe 12 hours of contact time per semester. So the semesters are a bit longer than Cambridge, but nothing existed before I joined. So I kind of had to come up with the material. It was quite good because it's very linked to my research topic. So I learned a lot, which was very good. But yeah, it was definitely a bit of a step up. And then I'm also going to do a new module next term, which will be maybe a lot more, so maybe 2 hours of lectures per week. It's been said, I also supervise dissertation students, so that's undergrads and MSc as well. And I'm also an academic tutor, which is a bit of a pastoral, but also supporting students developing new skills, especially first years. So we talked about things like unfair means, kind of more wider transferable skills and how you might develop that. I guess a big bit of the teaching as well, and the reason why I have a reduced load is that as Samantha mentioned, I am expected to get a qualification in teaching to become a fellow. And so as part of that, I've joined the course to get a postgraduate certification in teaching for learning in higher education. And so as part of my probation, it is a requirement that I kind of pass the 2 first modules. And that's what that's looked like. I've had a week-long workshop last year, and then I had to submit a portfolio. So I had a few months to work on it, and then I'm going to do another one in January. And that's been quite good to kind of reflect and learn about all those things like the teaching philosophy that I hadn't really thought about before. And it kind of brings me on to what I wish I'd known about teaching earlier, because as part of this certification, you need to observe your colleagues teach. And it's made me realize that it's the same in research. There's always a bit of an imposter syndrome. So you think you're the only person who's not confident about something. And obviously that's not true. I think Sue's brought it up as well. And so observing my colleague has really shown me that it's really helpful to talk about those things. the one thing that I was terrified of doing, which is make a mistake in an equation, is something that's actually really useful, because then you can demonstrate how you would see that something's wrong and how you'd fix it. And so, yeah. So basically, everyone makes mistakes, and it's really good to talk to your colleagues about it. So that's all for me.
Thank you so much, Carolanne. That's really interesting and very helpful to think that, you know, something as simple as talking to one another now about our teaching or observing people is something that can help with your own development and your own confidence as well. And thank you for sharing the variety and types of teaching that you've done. I think it's interesting to think about how different universities teach in different ways. So it's interesting to hear about the tutorial and the transferable skills that you're working on there. So thank you again for your introduction. And now I think we'll be able to come to Maria, although I've just seen there is a fire alarm. So Maria, if you're able to come on and do your introduction, it would be great to hear from you.
Hello everyone. Hello everyone. Thank you for the invite. Yeah, unfortunately now we just have like the fire alarm. So all the students are actually outside. You know, there have been people in the labs, but now everyone had to be outside. So we're here like in the central of London, Westminster. Maybe I can share a few thoughts quickly.
Thank you.
Of course, yeah. So my career path is similar. I think to a few people already talked. So I've done a postdoc following my PhD. So I've done my PhD in medical genetics back in Cyprus. I'm from Cyprus, so at the Cyprus Institute of Neurology and Genetics. And I was a postdoc in Belgium first, in KU Leuven, for 2 years, looking at cancer diagnostics. And then I moved into Oxford for 1 year and in Cambridge. So of course I had a more in-depth research background rather than teaching. So I had 6 years of postdoc. So for me, it was just in the right time to move from the research career to teaching. Can you hear me, or there's a lot of background?
We can hear. I can hear you. There's a little bit of
Okay, that's
background
great.
noise, but yeah, thank you. Thanks, Adam.
Yeah, so one of the challenging things is like people that have been at postdocs maybe for 6 or 7 years, then they find it really difficult to transition to a more academic independent position. While I was in Oxford and both in Cambridge, I tried to be involved in the college system. I was trying to be involved in some of the supervisions of the colleges. So what I would suggest, be brave and ask people if you can contribute in any way in their tutorials. For example, in the teaching. So even if you have a small teaching experience, meaning that just supervising 10 students in a tutorial is still important. And also I had the opportunity maybe to give a small lectures of 30 people, but also these add a few things on my CV. And when I got my position here, actually I'm a lecturer only now for it's my second year, so I only joined Westminster University last September. What I think what really made me a good candidate is because I have a lot of diversity on my background. So it was more about cancer research, about maybe prenatal diagnosis. So it's this combination of diverse background. I think that you can actually go out there and teach different modules, because as Samantha said, you often are asked to go in the class and teach something that you're not very familiar. For example, I'm teaching medical physiology to biomedical sciences students, although my expertise is on cancer. So I really need to do some background reading before I go into the class, be confident, have a simple way to explain to them the pathophysiology of a disease. So often we're asked to teach something that we're not very familiar, but what I would suggest is try and find the right way to communicate this to your students, and also to make things more interesting. Westminster University is a more teaching-focused university, so I would say that we don't have a lot of time allocation for research, and in order to do that, either you need to work with your master students. So you are usually have some master students during the summertime and progress more on that for your research. Now I'm more involved in modules like medical genetics, genomics, as well as I said, medical physiology, but also in first year teaching students like biochemistry, because the students are such a high number. So we have like 500 students. Of course, most of the new lecturers like me, they will need to contribute in these basic modules like biochemistry, for example. That is a common module across many disciplines. A description of, so maybe highlight of my teaching commitments would be to also teach my undergrad students the project. So I need to supervise and come up with projects for the undergrad students for their thesis. So this is what I found more challenging here, because with a limited resources, you need to design some specific experiments for them to be able to do in the lab, and also to guide them how to write their thesis. So, and meanwhile, you need also to prepare your teaching for your modules. Yes, and my current, what I was talking know about teaching earlier is, maybe having known what modules you're gonna be involved earlier, you'll have you could prepare a bit better. Although sometimes it's a bit of last minute when someone is not there, so you need to jump on and assist on the module. Yes. Hello.
Yeah, you're just on mute, Vicky. Vicky, you're just on
I'm
mute.
on mute. I apologise. I was just saying to Maria, thank you very much, Maria, for making that work from outside of your building in Westminster. I'm really grateful that you were able to do that. It looks like you're on a mobile, so thank you for being flexible with that. So just something that you said earlier on, actually, Maria, that was, about being brave and contributing to teaching, and maybe sort of being brave and teaching something that you haven't taught before. And it's kind of picking up on a couple of things that people have said already in their introductions, but also in the chat. There have been a couple of questions. I think there was one earlier on.
Yes.
About teaching experience. And so I thought I might put this to a couple of people on the panel, if that's okay. So somebody asked how you can get different types of teaching experience when you are on a funded postdoc, for example. So your time is meant to be dedicated, obviously, to the research that you're doing. So how can we think of sort of creative, innovative ways to find different teaching experiences, and what would be enough? So I guess I'm just inviting the panel to respond to that in terms of ideas that we could come up with to find teaching opportunities, maybe sort of slightly outside of the box ideas, and how we can sort of make it work in applications, and what would be enough. Sue, could I come to you first on that, please?
Yeah, thanks, Vicky. So I wanted to answer that question, so I'm glad you've asked me. I always see teaching as a way of consolidating my research. So even if I'm teaching, and I do have to teach topics I know nothing about, but I always see it as an opportunity to learn things from a different perspective. So if I had to justify teaching to a funder, I would say, I'm going to do this little bit of teaching because it's going to help me consolidate my knowledge in this part of my research. And the sort of thing, I don't think you have to do loads as a postdoc. If you're going for the kind of, if you're going for a full out teaching job, maybe, but if you're going for a classical kind of, you're going to have your own research program and you're going to teach, I think to be honest, for us, the most important thing is the research, but we want to see that people have been willing. So if you identified a course in your department, in my department, it would be a set of practicals. And there are all sorts of practicals on all topics. So it would be easy for any postdoc in PDN or any graduate student in PDN to find a practical class that's sort of related to their research. ask if you can be a demonstrator in that class. We're always looking for people who are reliable, who turn up, are willing and enthusiastic. And then that would be your contribution in a larger classroom setting. I think it's unlikely you're going to get a lecture to give if you're a PhD student, maybe if you're a postdoc, but practical classes all the time. We have PhD students and postdocs helping us out, and that helps you then, like my PhD student recently demonstrated a practical class on action potentials, and that's what she does in her research. It really helped the way she understand what she knows about action potentials to have to teach it to medical and veterinary students. So it's kind of like being really clever in what you pick.
So yeah, so aligning it to what you're already doing and amassing
Yeah.
knowledge about anyway,
Yeah.
and taking the chance to teach about it. And so it sounds like, Sue,
Yeah.
you're advocating for reaching out to different
Yeah.
departments and people who might be in need of people who could be demonstrators or run
Yeah.
practicals or
Yeah.
indeed supervisions.
Yeah, because when people apply for jobs in our department and they've been in Cambridge a long time and they haven't done any teaching, it's like Samantha was saying earlier, it's a bit of a flag, a warning flag, because there are colleges, there are practicals, there are seminars, there's so many opportunities to help out with teaching. Even if like your PI teaches in a seminar, like more interactive class, ask if you can come along and help with the interactive elements. It's all experience. And it's good experience because then it's related to your project. So just don't sit back and wait for someone to ask you to do it. Think if you want that teaching experience, you do have to, I think Maria said, be brave and go out and ask for it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sue. Shreyasi, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just wanted to add to that by saying that during my postdoc, I was on the ESRC fellowship, and I did do a little bit of teaching, even though there was no expectation from the funder to actually do teaching. Couple of things that I did at Cambridge was, of course, the supervision in different colleges, but also I delivered like a one-off lecture in a methodological course where they were looking for people to like fill in some aspects on qualitative research, which was my area of interest as well. So I did get a bit of an exposure to large group classroom teaching through that methods module. Also did a one-off lecture in an area of my research interest that my supervisor was teaching at that point. So they often look for like these one-off lectures from the specialized areas of interest that a postdoc might be working on. So do look out for maybe those kind of opportunities. And the third thing that was helpful for me as a PhD, I did some revision, kind of large group supervision for the MPhil courses in my department in development studies. So also like revising, a couple of theories that people were focusing on. So I guess also a mix of teaching, both large group and small group teaching, but also a mix of maybe methodological teaching, teaching in your areas of expertise and maybe slightly outside. So a lot of those combinations already exist within the Cambridge system. So maybe worth checking with different people as to where you might be able to fit in, regardless of the funder's requirement. So that would be great.
That's really helpful. So it's almost taking the thing that's like adjacent to your research, like a tool that enables it. So looking at methodologies or going back to theories that, those sort of basic things that are needed. And also the idea, I think what you're impressing here is find one-off opportunities as well as those like regular ones that Sue was talking about. Thank you very much, Shreyasi. So Carolanne, your thoughts on this?
No, so I agree with everything that was said. I guess just in terms of the departments I know about, so engineering and maths, I know they had marketplace or bazaars or whatever, where they would advertise supervision opportunities. So it would literally be a director of study saying, I'm looking for someone to help out with thermofluids in this college. And that's how you could hear about those kind of supervision opportunities. And then just to echo the one-off lectures, one thing I did do as a postdoc in Cambridge as well was I delivered the kind of taster lecture as part of an open day, which was really good because I had to talk about my research, but in a way that was accessible to 17, 18-year-olds. So it's a good example of demonstrating how you would communicate kind of big concepts to maybe, so that could also be an opportunity.
Carol, yeah, that's really helpful for two reasons, actually. One of them is that someone's just asked a question in the chat about where are the places that you can find those one-off lectures. I just wondered, Carolanne, if you've got any advice. So yes, if someone in the department or a college is emailing out, but are there any other ways that you might be able to share in terms of getting yourself aligned with one-off lectures?
It is, I would say at Imperial, it was very rare I've never heard of a PhD giving a lecture, and I heard a postdoc doing it once. So it's not something that's always common, but maybe through those outreach types of things might be a good way to do it as well. Yeah, that's the only things I can think of.
Fantastic.
But I think as a PhD, it is quite difficult to do a lecture on your own with a big group. I would expect it to be quite unusual.
Okay, all right, and I'll come back to you about the point about talking to the school age students as well, because that relates to a question that someone's just asked as well. Samantha, on this point of finding other teaching experiences.
Yeah, so I mean, Sue mentioned about how you would kind of justify teaching to the funding body, and yeah, consolidating your own learning is one of those, but also it's dissemination of the work that you're doing. You know, science communication, from my perspective, science communication is such a key thing. And it looks quite good if you're telling the, oh yeah, I'm spreading the good news about my research to these people, and then tying that in with what Shreyasi was saying about the kind of finding those one-off lectures. And I think if you, going back to what I said about really familiarizing yourself with the courses that are running at the place you're applying to, well, the same thing applies to the courses at the department that you're already in, and finding the research that you're doing is cutting edge in which topic. What is the fundamental module where the seeds for that research are planted? And then speak to whoever's convening that module and say, look, I'm doing this research in this area, which I think would be really interesting to your students. Is there an opportunity for me to come and give a guest lecture? And that's it. So it's something value added for those students, which the module leader will love because it looks good on the on their kind of record. It'll be useful to the students, especially if you've got kind of final year MSc students who are thinking about further study and trying to think, oh, okay, so this is where this is going. This is the research informed teaching. And then you get to talk about your research, but you have to make it fit into that module, which is something you can talk about in an interview, in how you had to kind of shape what you were doing, contextualize it to work to that situation. So it's kind of bringing in what everybody's been saying and kind of say, right, okay, what you have to do, I think what you have to do is actually go back to the course, the undergraduate course and the postgraduate taught course in your department to see where does your research actually fit into what the young ones are doing, and then take it back to them and introduce them to the topic and share that passion with them.
That's great. Thank you so much, Samantha, and very encouraging about thinking about the sort of bigger picture of your research and the underlying concepts and ideas and where that sits within a module, and being brave and just reaching out to those module leaders. I think that's really helpful to hear that. So a question earlier on in the chat, or just a moment ago really, was about sort of, I guess, teaching adjacent things. So outreach, open days, public engagement. So the question was, how does teaching outside the university environment compare private tutoring summer schools for high school kids, further education level teaching? So I wonder if I could perhaps come to you, Sue, on this, in terms of how that looks, if you get people talking about those in applications for lectureships as sort of evidence of teaching ability. How does that sit from a committee point of view, do you think?
Thanks, Vicky. Yeah, I would say that we look at that not just from a teaching point of view, but from a kind of service point of view. And another thing I'm really proud of my colleagues for is that they almost always want to hire someone who they think is going to be a good citizen and not be, I think Samantha was talking about this earlier, when you ask them to do something, they say, no, I couldn't possibly do that. It's not my area and I'm too busy doing my research. So if someone's got those sorts of things on their CV, it suggests they're a person who cares and wants to give to the community. Unless, of course, they're just doing them to put them on the CV. So, sound genuine. But obviously, it depends. If you've organised a sort of interactive workshop activity at a science festival, say, or an arts festival, that involves a lot of work, that shows you might be good at organising a practical class. Or if you've given a talk at an outreach, a school or whatever, it shows that you can deliver a lecture. So it all helps and has that added benefit of showing that you do things that you don't have to do and that you think of the bigger picture. For a long time in my area, the Research Council fundings used to ask us to put sections in our grants about communicating what we do to the wider public. And so I think there was a lot more of that going on, and now they're not. So I think when people, not so much. And so I think when people have actually taken the trouble to do that, it is impressive. However, if I can just add to that again, that none of this will matter if you want a job that's research and teaching. None of this will matter if you haven't got your papers as well, and you can't demonstrate that track record. So my danger sometimes is I get very enthusiastic about these kinds of things, and I really care about these kinds of things, and it's tempting to forget to do the other parts of the job as well. So just be careful not to balance your time well.
Thank you. Yes, that balance. And it's a reminder, I think, that we can't talk about teaching in isolation in some ways. I mean, we can, because we need to understand it. We need to understand how to talk about it. But as a skill set, it extends into other areas as well. So thank you, Sue. That's really, really helpful. A couple more questions that have come up in the chat, and I'm just going to whiz back up to find this one. But essentially, somebody was talking about the fact that they had a pause into a long maternity and parenting break. So their teaching experience with undergraduates is quite a while ago, but still have what they retained. Are there any suggestions on how to update in terms of being ready for that academic teaching role? And I'm reading that in terms of how to update knowledge about teaching, I think. Any thoughts on that from anyone in particular? Samantha, thank you.
I would suggest, and obviously this depends on location as to whether you've got a university nearby that has that kind of culture. But say if it was someone in the Northeast where I'm based, I would say, well, if we've got some part-time lecturing opportunities for you, we can get you involved in that, because you wouldn't be left to your own devices. You'd be supported by a full-time colleague, and that's a good way to kind of dip your toe in. And then once you've got that, then you say, right, okay, oh gosh, students have changed since I last saw them, type thing, and you kind of refresh your memory about how to work with students, and then you're able to apply for a full-time role whenever that comes up. So the part-time lecturing, I know 0-hour contracts and get a bad rep for obvious reasons, but this is one situation where actually it can work in your favor to try and kind of, you don't want the full 37 hours a week, here's 3 modules to you don't want that level. You want just, right, give me half a module, which I know I have the technical ability to deliver, and then I'm not having, I can just learn the ropes of the administrative, the management side of it, and then I can apply for a larger role. So I think if there's a part-time lecturer opportunity, I think for that individual, I think that might be the best way to brush up on what they need to brush up on.
Thank you very much, Samantha. And I'm also thinking about what Carolanne was saying about observing people as well. I wonder if there's value in doing something like that as well, if they've got the knowledge of the teaching and it's sort of just seeing what's going on in their subject area potentially. Thank you to you all for answering questions in the chat as we've been going along as well. I'm very grateful to you for doing that. There is another question about people's views on temporary teaching positions. I believe these roles will offer valuable teaching experience, but I also came across a blog post where it was emphasised about the importance of research achievements, and the post suggests that and it's not teaching. The advice was along the lines of, if you're on a temporary teaching job, okay, so try to use the time more for research rather than teaching. So I guess this comes back to what you were saying, Sue, about that balance. It is really hard. It's really hard to know, isn't it? How do we work out how to keep the balance between teaching and research? And if you're in a teaching only position on a temporary basis, how do we pay attention to the research? I wonder if anyone has anything to say on how we manage that time. Sue, thank you.
Sorry to leap in, everyone, but I was going to say it's because we in my department, we've got 3 posts that are entirely devoted to teaching, and those people are fantastic teachers and do an amazing job in the way that, from listening to Samantha, I think Samantha's done that as well, organizing things, having the big picture, marshalling us all so we're presenting a common front. But they're permanent posts, so that's fantastic. Sometimes we have money from somewhere, like a new lecturer comes and they get a fantastic 5-year, 6-year fellowship, and then we can hire a temporary lecturer. And I really worry about those posts. I worry that someone will apply and then start doing that and then think, oh my goodness, I haven't done any research and now my post is almost up. And I always encourage the head of department to be very clear with them what opportunities will be available. We did hire someone in my department on those lines last year, and those of us in the same subject area have been rallying around trying to create opportunities for that person to do some research in our labs, because that post didn't come with lab space or money or anything, because we're all really worried that if this is a temporary post and it doesn't get renewed, we don't want him to find himself in a difficult situation. But this was his conscious choice. He really didn't want this kind of highly stressful doing both to a very high level sort of thing. And he's a fantastic teacher. So and on those of us who have worked with him want him to stay, but whether there's money there, that's a tricky thing. So I think you have to really think carefully about giving up the research and going into teaching if it's a temporary post, and think about, 5 years down the line when the post is coming to an end, what options will I have and am I prepared for that? If you make that decision as being right for you, knowing that, and you've spoken to the heads of department, don't just assume they're going to renew you, and if you're very clear and everyone's been transparent and get it in writing, then that's a very positive thing. But if you go in thinking, oh, they'll keep me on, then that's dangerous, I think.
Thank you. So Shreyasi, you have got your hand up.
Yeah, just wanted to add to that what Sue said about, especially I relate to this dimension of temporary roles a lot, partly because in the last 2 years or 3 years of looking at the job market, I think there's been a huge rise in these 1-2 year type teaching positions, either as a buyout based on somebody else's research time or as a maternity cover. And I got those feedbacks and advice as well as an early career about, focusing more on research papers, grants, and less kind of on teaching. So I hear you on that, Noel, and that's the same kind of advice. But it's also hard to know where to strike that balance, while on one hand, that advice is partly correct. But when I also faced the interview panel, there were questions on teaching. I was expected to demonstrate that. So I feel like for some reason, we are expected to tick off almost all of those boxes in some or the other way. We choose which ones to emphasize and which ones to kind of, somehow do it, but not, maybe that's not one of the strength areas playing out in the interview. But I got a feeling from my interviews in the last few years that, it was still the research, the papers, the grants that scored quite high up in the larger scheme of things, especially for a permanent lectureship position. And the teaching also had to be done, but probably did not score as much in the grand scheme of things. So it's trying to like get that balance on what we put forward in the way we craft the application.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Shreyasi, for adding to that. Samantha, a thought from you on this?
Yeah, just to defend the senior management of universities for a bit. I think the blog post that's being mentioned is that's quite a common kind of view that, oh, well, it's the research that gets you the promotion, so the teaching is something you have to endure whilst you wait to be recognized for all the fantastic work you've been doing, which is it's difficult because on the one hand, yes, okay, if your research is your kind of, that's your life's passion, but at the same time, the teaching, for a lot of institutions, the teaching is what keeps the lights on. So, there is that kind of balance. But I do think there are a number of institutions that have recognized this, and they've tried to introduce career pathways that focus more on the teaching, so permanent career pathways. So when I applied, I mentioned that I wanted a teaching, that type of job wasn't available. It was either you do a teaching fellow, which is the kind of fixed term role, or you get a lectureship and try and kind of shape it into what you want. Whereas now there are teaching only lecture positions, teaching and research lecture positions, research only lecture positions. So universities have tried to kind of diversify their career pathways. So I think it's a good time in that respect if you have a personal preference about what you want your career to look like. And I would say I appreciate the desire to have kind of the steady income and the stable the job, but try and kind of go for the type of job that, right, if I'm stuck in this forever, I'm happy, because it's quite difficult to, once you're in there, it's quite difficult to jump about, which is what I think people have been saying. So I think, yeah, it's just to note that the traditional lecturer thing, where it's research with a bit of teaching, that has changed. And some universities, quite a few actually, have tried to create proper progression pathways to account for that. All of this needs to then be looked at with the lens of the current economic climate being faced by HE institutions. So in terms of what Sue was saying about posts not being renewed, that is even more likely in the current climate, unfortunately. So we just have to be conscious that, right, the universities want to have staff because they need people to teach students, they need people to do research, but also they're trying to save money. So you kind of have to understand the full picture and then apply for the post that's going to keep you safe, as it were.
Thank you, Samantha. I really appreciate that sort of macro, bigger picture view of what's happening.
I think that's something that perhaps when we apply for the first job, when we don't spend enough time trying to appreciate, and really that's the one that's going to affect what we end up doing on a day-to-day basis, because we just get pushed from side to side depending on what's going on, and we don't really have that much control over it. So I think being aware of that landscape can help at least help explain why you're being asked to do this thing that, why this is nothing to do with me, why, and if you can understand it, then it can make it a little bit more manageable.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And the resources that I was talking about earlier on in the introduction, we've got some videos on understanding the academic job market in terms of a sector and the drivers and the things that shape it in the UK, and why we have the research excellence framework or the teaching excellence framework, because all of those are the drivers for the things that you're ultimately talking about. So we'll plug you all in our audience to those resources so you can have a look at that bigger picture thing in a moment. We're running down into the sort of last 10 to 15 minutes of the session, and I think we've had some brilliant ideas, comments and thoughts on how we can find different types of teaching experiences and what teaching might look like in other institutions. But I wonder if for the last part of the session, we could sort of draw our attention to preparing for being recruited into a lectureship and how we might position some of that teaching. And so I was wondering if I could come to Carolanne and Shreyasi initially to ask about your ideas for somebody who is perhaps in a postdoc at the end of their PhD, who are thinking of applying for lectureships at some point in the future. What kind of things would you be recommending people do to start getting their heads into a place where they can write a teaching statement or talk about their teaching in an application or an interview? So Carolanne, if I could come to you first, please, I'd be very grateful.
Yeah, so I think we've talked about loads of different things. One is that research of knowing the types of teaching that's happening around you in your current institution, and if you have another institution in mind, what that looks like. Maybe looking into the fellowship of the higher education, if there's a bit of time and that's something you want to work on, there's different pathways for it. So that's a good way to get kind of just learn the vocabulary in a way of how you talk about those things, which is often some stuff you've experienced as a student, but you might not know how you would talk about it. So then it becomes quite useful when it comes to interviews. Maybe more practically, when it comes to, oh, you've actually been selected, shortlisted, you've been invited to do a presentation. I think practicing is always useful, talking to different people. So I think those presentations I talked about, I did it at least once with my partners, the kind of easy, nice person, just to check. I did it with my PI, which was a bit scary, but then also I really trusted their opinion and they knew the topic, so that was really good. And then I might have practiced with you, Diane, actually. So I practiced a few times in Cambridge and that was really good as well. So those are the more maybe practical, just the more you talk about it, the easier it gets, I guess, as well. So that's always good to do.
Yeah, that's great. Talk about it. I wonder maybe if we don't talk about teaching as much as we talk about the research. So maybe it's making a habit of that as well. Thank you, Carolanne. Shreyasi, anything from you to add to that?
Yeah, just without repeating myself, maybe to what's been said already. The one thing that I didn't quite keep a track of was also trying to evidence any feedback about my teaching. People often give us like formal or informal feedback about how the lecture went, either the module leaders or, during supervisions or any one-off emails that we might receive from our students. It's really important to keep an evidence of some of those aspects, because in the teaching presentation, often in universities recently I've seen they do ask for any kind of feedback that you have received based on your teaching. Sometimes it's a more formal feedback based on module reviews if you have done, but sometimes even these informal feedbacks from mentors or tutors and stuff counts. So do keep a track on some of those statements that probably you can directly quote in your presentations, which is quite useful. So keep a track of your these things as evidence.
That is such a good idea, isn't it? To record those things and to know that people can refer to those more informal pieces of feedback as well as evidence that somebody has noticed something about your teaching or it's made a difference to them in a certain way. So I think that's such a practical piece of advice. Thank you very much, Shreyasi. Carolanne.
Well, just to add on to this point, keep track of it and then keep track of what you've done about it. So even if it was, oh, this didn't work and I didn't understand, talking about how you might then have changed your teaching, then that's really good. Because I know here, this is something we do with the big surveys, right? The students have told this, so we've changed this, and that's how. So I think if you're able to do that, in your interview or whatever, that's really good. And great. I don't think I knew about it then. So,
Clara, thinking about how you've reflected on it and taken it forward. So brilliant. So Thank you, Shreyasi. I'm just going to point out the question that you've just answered, which Peter popped in the chat, which is a really good one. And I feel like we get this in appointments a lot when we talk to people about whether they can include feedback in an application form for a job. And it's always really encouraging, I think, to see that kind of evidence written in an application. It becomes very specific to the person then. So thank you for affirming that, Shreyasi, that yes, that is a useful thing for people to be doing in the application. And I think Maria has unfortunately had to leave us. So Sue and Samantha, from your point of view, are there any kind of final tips that you might share for people who are preparing for an application that includes teaching or an interview? Sue, I will come to you first.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I would say that a key thing is to talk to your supervisor, mentor, PI, whatever that title is. I think sometimes students are afraid, and postdocs even are afraid to tell their mentor that they're thinking about teaching. If they're in a very sort of high-powered research place, they think that their PI will think that that's not what they should be doing. They should be focusing on the next Nature paper and all of that. But actually, again, most of my colleagues would be very supportive of their colleagues if they said that they wanted to go into teaching and offer them the advice, you know, from their own experiences and things like that. You know, Carolanne and Shreyasi were talking about their own applications. Well, if your PI, when they write their reference, also mentions your teaching feedback in their letter, that could be the real string in your bow as well. And so I think it's important to let your PI know, if you feel comfortable about that you're going to apply for jobs where teaching is important, and could they please mention that and ask if there are any additional opportunities they could create for you. So get them on board, and as long as you're still doing the research for them, they should be on board, right? So that we're supposed to mentor our people and look after them. So I hope so.
Thank you, Sue. So be brave and share your career aspirations with your supervisor. Samantha, anything from you on this?
Yeah, I've got a couple of kind of short-term practical things as well as the overall thing. I'll do the short-term ones that came to mind earlier. With your CV, if you're applying for a post that has an expectation of teaching and research, obviously, you know, the research side, you put your selected publications and so on. With the teaching, when you're putting the skills that you have, kind of be very specific about what level of skill that you have, because going back to what I was saying about, right, we're desperate, so-and-so is on sick leave, we need to find somebody to do this lecture. That person needs to have these skills, right? Sift through what information do I have about what people can do. And if you had put, oh yeah, I can do Python, no problem. And it's that you've maybe done one program in Python, you can't kind of help out with a lab session, then that's going to expose you quite quickly, because you never know which part of your CV the person looking at it is going to pick up. And actually, this is something I picked up from the Cambridge Career Service when I was a PhD student. So this is kind of a weird kind of full circle in that, you know, it was a good lesson for me. It's like, right, okay, I've read your CV and this is what I've picked up. It's like, oh no, that's not what I wanted you to pick up on. So you know, go through that exercise to try and make sure that you're emphasizing the bits that you want emphasized. Good practice for any job application, but specifically with this kind of thing where in a year's time, they say, oh, you said you could do this. I need someone to teach this module. Yeah. So, you know, so that you're only kind of signing up for stuff you can deliver. And the other thing is, I mean, this might be specific to engineering. I know there are a few engineers on the call. I saw in the chat, engage with your professional body. So whether that is the IMechE, the IET, the IC, whatever professional body, because Sue mentioned academic citizenship as being important, and a lot of courses, especially engineering courses, will be accredited by those professional bodies, and there are requirements for a certain number of chartered engineers or a certain number of engineers with a certain level of membership. And if you can show, you don't have to be chartered, but if you can show that you are working towards charter, or that you are aware of the professional body and you're engaged with it, that can be the difference between someone who has a similar research profile and has just gone, oh, well, I just do my research, and industries, that's somebody else's business. So I think kind of engaging with the PSRB can be a really positive thing. I think kind of the overall thing, there's been a bit of conversation, and I think in the chapter as well, about the kind of hierarchy, teaching versus research, especially from the point of view of PIs and PhD supervisors. At the end of the day, you have to make the career that you want. And if that doesn't fit in with what your PI had in mind for you, well, tough. They're not the ones who have to do this for the next 30, 40 years, you are. So I think you need to make sure that you know what you want. And I think if you know what you want, then that comes across much better in an interview, rather than, I've been told that this is the next step. So I'm here, give me a job, please. So you have to know that, right, I am passionate about, and if you are not that keen on the teaching bit, then don't apply to an institution where teaching is a clear focus. Go apply to an institution that is much more research focused, because the chances are that you'll be allowed to do you'll be allowed to capitalize on your research. Whereas if it's the alternative, if it's the opposite, then don't spend time applying to institutions where they are going to be expecting a lot from you for the research, because you're not going to be happy. And if you're not going to be happy, then you're not going to be there for that long. Let's face it, you have to be it is a hard slog. Academic burnout is a real thing. If you read the articles, you will know that it's a concern for everybody. So you have to enjoy what you are doing. You have to be passionate about what you're doing. So I think that's really important, and you kind of carve out the career that you want, regardless of. You can change your mind, that's fine, but don't kind of do something because your PI said you should, or your supervisor said you should, or your parents or whoever. You have to make sure that you're doing something that works for you.
Thank you, Samantha. That authenticity about your own career objectives and making the stars align where possible. Thank you so much. And I can see, Maria, you're back on the call, and so we've got a couple of minutes left before I share our thanks and the feedback survey with the audience. So if I could just come to you and ask one final brief word, perhaps, on the one thing that you might do to get prepared for showcasing teaching in your application and interview.
Yes, so maybe a few things I'll also like to add. If you don't have teaching experience as well, I will go out there and maybe contact your network. So maybe from LinkedIn, from the people you might know that they're already on teaching positions. So offer, because of this high teaching load, people, if you have the expertise and you would like to contribute even to one lecture, they will be more than happy. Probably if you have the expertise and maybe you also have some research background, they will be more than happy to accommodate you in one of their modules. So if I knew that earlier, this is, for example, one thing I would do. Of course, there will need to be time in advance to get the approval from the university to do that. Especially for interviews, I'll say yes. Try maybe to contact someone who is already at the university, even maybe it's a different discipline from yours, but they will give you a bit of about the panel and how does that works. Practice on your teaching. It is not going to be about what information you have on your slide. It's more about how you deliver the lecture. and be prepared. Exactly, for example, if it's a teaching focused university, they will ask you questions about your pedagogical, what's your values. For example, I didn't mention before, but I had to do the PG cert, so this is mandatory. The PG cert, I don't know if this was mentioned in our discussion before. So it was a bit tricky to me to balance my work during my first year as a lecturer, but also complete the PG cert in 1 year. So I had to juggle a lot between these two, but it's important to do that. It helped me a lot, I will say, before being a module leader. So complete your PG cert, and this is something that will help you being more confident in the class, and find alternative ways and new ways to teach.
Thank you. Thanks, Maria. That was a very helpful, in a way, summary of many of the practical things that people have suggested or inferred that we might do. So thank you so much. And I'm going to draw us to a close now. But before I do that, I really just wanted to say, on behalf of everybody who's in the audience today and from the Careers Service, an enormous thank you to our speakers, Sue, Carolanne, Maria, Shreyasi and Samantha. It's been absolutely amazing that you've shared your time with us today and the preparation you've done to join us. We are really, really grateful that you have given us this time to share your experiences with our audience. So a very, very big thank you from all of us.